Well, Ancestry.com is enjoying a brisk business, believe me, even in my own family. Sometimes you find out things about your ancestors you didn't want to know. Other times it's very interesting. But there's a profound sense of ancestry in the Scriptures. The Gospel makes this astounding declaration about Jesus. But to as many as received him, to them he gave the authority to become sons and daughters of God. Children born not of earthly parents, but born of God. So whatever is true about you biologically, the truer thing is, well, those you are related to by faith in Jesus Christ. So this series, Cloud of Witnesses, that's a scriptural term for all those folks that we are family with and who are present in the presence of God. The God who has no past or future, they are as alive to him and in him as we are. So we've introduced you to a bit of family in this series. I love it, and really one of my very favorites. In fact, these are people you probably never heard of, some of them, but they've affected you. And this person this morning in particular is one who's had enormous influence in really Western civilization. To tell us about him, Dr. Daniel Napier is a professor of theology at Austin Graduate School of Theology. He teaches a range of courses: theology, spiritual formation, patristics, New Testament, and missions. He's been a missionary. He's been a church planter. He does a lot of other things. I just want you to know that I was looking at him and I was saying, gosh, he didn't get that body reading books. And Daniel has actually been a very competitive power lifter. And that's not just going out and doing the benches. That's a thing called a clean and jerk, the snatch. This is serious stuff. And Daniel has spent a good portion of his life. In fact, when he was serving in Croatia, really had an outreach to young Croatian men who would come to his basement and pump iron, or whatever you want to call it in the powerlifting world, and help build a church with this kind of stuff. But anyway, Daniel, I just thought that was cool. And come and tell us about Augustine family. Let's welcome him.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ben. Grace and peace to you. It's really good to be here. It's a joy to be able to introduce Augustine to you. Let me tell you just a little bit about him. I want to lead you through kind of a picture that he gives us of an ordinary Christian life. But first, a little bit about him. We've got this fresco from the Lateran Chapel in Rome is the earliest depiction that we have of Augustine. And it's painted within about 70 years of his death. May have some living memory, maybe based on an earlier depiction of him. So this is perhaps actually what he looks like. That's not Ben Patterson, that's Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine is born and raised in North Africa in what today would be kind of crossing over between Tunisia and Algeria. And he was raised in a mixed home. His mother was very, very devout as a believer, and his father was just almost pagan. Didn't convert until his deathbed to Christ. In his youth, Augustine was very wayward religiously. He just couldn't buy into the church and the picture of God that he heard from the kind of uneducated clergy around him. And so he went off through this search that led him through a heresy called Manichaeism. But through all this time, he was a very, very intelligent young man, and he was scholarly. And he studied rhetoric, and went through the schools in North Africa and Carthage, and he ends up at kind of the apex of his career. In his early 30s, he's in Milan, in the imperial court, and he is the chair of rhetoric. In terms of prestige for academic positions, that's kind of the equivalent of a professorship at Harvard today. He had gone to the very top of his world in terms of intellect. And it's while he was there, pursuing ambitions, pleasures, prestige, that God got a hold of him. And he turned him from those pursuits to a life in which he would be focused on devotion. And in that devotion, he heads back to North Africa with just a small group of friends to live a life that we would talk about as monastic. Few people living together simply to engage in ongoing prayer and study. And within a couple years, he's actually ordained against his will, becomes a priest, and he spends the last 40 years of his life, this brilliant man, opening the scriptures to very simple people in North Africa. Helping ordinary folks like you and me make sense of this life that's available in Jesus. And it's through that humble, simple service that the vast footprint that he's left on Western civilization is made. As he goes about trying to explain things and kind of work out problems for people in the faith, he makes contributions that would be seminal in fields not only of theology, but philosophy and social theory and historiography. Really, his contribution is so vast, he kind of functions today like a skeleton key to the Western intellectual tradition. If you know Augustine well, then you can go a lot of places. You can go a lot of places with that. Now, what I want to ask you to do is walk into his basilica with me. Okay? And as you walk in, he's already taken his seat and he's begun to expound the scriptures. And if you listen to him, if you attend to what's going on, you'll realize rather quickly that this guy's trying to convert you. He wants more than anything to see, more accurately, to see Christ convert you, turn you toward God. And when you realize that, I don't know, at least some of you, I'm sure you're going to say, whoa, too late, right? You can't convert me, been there, done that. I've, accepted Jesus into my heart. I gave my testimony to my youth group. You're too late for this thing. But that would not stop Augustine. Okay? He would still be trying to convert you, and the reason he's trying to convert you is because he has a different understanding of conversion than you probably encountered in the churches that you're from. Okay? Most of us have this idea of conversion as this kind of one-time lightning bolt event where we turn to Christ, we accept him, and everything changes after that, right? And all you have to do to kind of get the picture that we're used to is kind of think of the typical testimony that you hear at church. If you boil them down, they kind of sound like this, don't they? Oh man, I was bad. I was awful. I drank too much. I got in fights all the time. I was with a different woman every night of the week. And then when I was 9 years old, I accepted Jesus into my heart. Right? And if you kind of boil them down, that's the typical testimony that you hear today. Some of us, it happens a little later than age 9, but the idea is that, all the sin and all the bad stuff happens on one end, this lightning bolt event, and then all of life from there on out is supposed to be just kind of one piece, more of the same. But that's not everything there is to conversion. Okay, now, true conversion, Augustine knows, is actually a lifelong project. It's actually the sort of thing that the entire Christian life could be described as, is a long process of conversion. You see, there are layers to us. There are pieces of my heart, of my life, that I don't have access to instantly. And so even though I've turned to God multiple times, I need to do it again. I need to do it again. There is more of me that is not yet surrendered to God. And I just know that's true of you as well. Okay? There's more of us there. And so conversion, you want to think about it more like peeling an onion than flipping a light switch. Okay? That it's the sort of thing that has stages that can last that last our entire life. We'll always be finding more parts that need to be turned to God. And Augustine wants to lead us through that. That's what he does for the last 40 years of his life. He leads people like you and me through a process of conversion. So let me just tell you where we're heading in this session, and then we'll do it. Okay? In this session, I want to talk to you a bit about the beginning point of conversion, where we start out, and the goal, the end point of conversion. And there's lots of stages in between, but of course, like I said, this is a lifelong project, so we can't give all the details. But I want us to get a clear picture of where we start and where we're headed, and then we'll talk a little bit about the means of conversion, how God gets us from where we start to where He desires for us to end up. Let me just kind of give this panoramic to start with. The process of conversion is one in which we move from a beginning point in which I kind of think of myself as the center of things. I am at the center of reality, and I am this standalone entity that is kind of coterminous with my body, right? And the whole world revolves around me. I don't know if you're aware of that. Did you know the world revolves around me? It seems very obvious to me. Because, you see, I can turn around and the world just spins around me. So obviously I'm the center of things, right? Now, I don't get it. Sometimes other people seem to be laboring under the misconception that the world revolves around them. Maybe you've bumped into people like that, when obviously it's revolving around me, right? Now, this is where we start. Right? We think of ourselves as the center of things. We're trying to stand on our own, and we imagine ourselves as being self-sufficient in our pride. Now, the result of that is what Augustine's going to call a restlessness of heart. Now, let me just real quickly say about where we're going to go before we talk about this restless heart. Conversion is a process that takes me from that place where I think I'm the center of things and gradually moves me to the place where I'm no longer the center at all, but what God is doing in Christ is the one thing that's important. That's the center of reality. And I come to understand myself, my body, all this, as just a limb of Christ, an extension of Jesus in the world. No more, no less. Okay? And at that spot, when finally I understand myself simply as a limb of Christ, it changes my whole way of interacting with you, with others in the world, my perception of myself. Everything changes at that point. Okay? So that's where we're headed. Let's come back over here and talk a bit about this place we begin. Augustine calls it the restless heart. And I think you can access this rather quickly. You can understand it experientially. If all you do is call to your mind the last time you had the misfortune of spending an afternoon alone at home. Okay? Nothing else in front of you, nothing to do. And suddenly you find this kind of dissatisfaction around you. You know what I'm talking about? Sitting there and all of a sudden itches and tummy rumbles and things like that. It's a little bit too big for me to deal with. And so I start thinking, man, something's wrong. So go and I look in the fridge and I kind of dig and I find something to eat. And I'm still not satisfied. So I start flipping through channels on the television. 500 of them, and there's nothing to watch, right? And I don't know, maybe I need to buy something, right? And go to Amazon or whatever. There's this kind of restlessness that we experience when we take all of the distractions of our life away. And it's rooted in this kind of determination to pretend that I stand all alone, okay? And so Augustine takes that starting point, which I think is something we all experience, and he uses it to frame his own story of conversion, of his turning to God in so many places. So this is the beginning of the Confessions. He says, "Great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Your power is immense, your wisdom beyond reckoning. And human beings, we who are a mere portion of your creation, long to praise you. We carry our mortality around with us, evidence of our sin and proof that you thwart the proud. Yet we humans, mere portions of your creation as we are, we do indeed long to praise you. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in you." For Augustine, the heart is, I use this phrase, a totality concept. It's a way of talking about kind of all that you are as a person, your hopes, your dreams, your fears, your aspirations, your longings, all of that. It's what you are as a person kind of moving in a direction. And so it's not just, when we hear the word heart, we think of emotion, I think, in our world. But for Augustine, the heart is kind of the whole person as it's moving in a particular direction. And Augustine has this picture of the human heart as having a kind of gravity to it. It's tugging, it's pulling in a particular direction. And that gravity it's a little bit different than what we think of, because it doesn't just fall downward. It seeks a place of rest. It seeks a place where everything kind of clicks, where it fits. And it knows that this is all that was needed. Right? And until that is found, there will be restlessness. And so Augustine says this. He says, "A body gravitates to its proper place by its own weight. This weight does not necessarily drag it downward, but pulls it to a place proper to it. Fire tends upward, a stone downward. Drawn by their weight, things seek their rightful places. They're not at rest as long as they're out of order, out of place. Now my weight is my love. Wherever I'm carried, it's my love that carries me there." It's the nature of persons, it's the nature of a human heart to be in search of satisfaction, to be in search of the place where you can say, okay, that's all I needed, right? And there to joyfully stop, to rest. And here's the thing, as long as we're in this self-centered state, we're always looking for satisfaction and we will never find it. Because it's just the nature of reality that there's only one thing big enough, good enough, beautiful enough, stable enough to actually give us rest, to give us satisfaction. And that's God. And so God, in his wisdom and mercy, he fashioned us so there's this itch that is never satisfied until we're focused on him. And so Augustine will describe various strategies that human beings use to try to scratch that itch. There's quick fix distractions that we fall into. It's the food binges, it's alcohol, it's YouTube spirals, it's that sort of thing. We'll use things to try to distract ourselves from that dissatisfaction. And then other things we turn to may last longer. Things like work, or aspiring for prestige, for promotions and things like that. And these are all things, these are things that we try to put in God's place. They're idols. And they'll last for a little while, but ultimately every idol leaves us dissatisfied, leaves us agitated, leaves us grief-stricken as it lets us down. Okay, so that's where we start, seeking various things to kind of play the role of God, and they're failing. And so we're restless, we're dissatisfied. So what is it that's needed? Well, what we need is ongoing conversion. We need to come to that place where, for Augustine, full conversion simply means that state where I am steadfastly clinging to Christ above everything else. I love walking around your campus because I keep seeing this little Latin phrase on signs when I walk around. Christus primatum tenens. Christ clinging to first place, holding first place. That's exactly what Augustine points us to in terms of the direction for human life in conversion. That when conversion is complete, I no longer think of myself as separate, but actually I've been so fully incorporated into Christ that I find myself as just an extension of Jesus in the world. And I'm caught up now in what God is doing in such a way that I'm so focused on God that all those things that I once sought satisfaction in just kind of fade to the margins, to the periphery. And let's see if I can describe a little bit of what that looks like, what that feels like. Okay. As an extension of Jesus in the world, it becomes possible for me to just kind of zoom, to focus on what God is doing in this moment for the people I'm interacting with. Right? Whether I'm at home with my family, whether I'm engaged in work, whether I'm studying or meeting people at the gym, wherever it is, I can kind of just zoom in, I can focus on nothing but God and what He's doing in the midst of that. And all these other things become peripheral. Now, let me be clear, that does not mean that they go away. Okay? You're still going to have work to do. You still have your papers to write. You still have games for your sports. You know, everything, all those things continue, but now they find their organizing place around God at the center. And because of that, they finally yield the good that God created for them in place under Him. Now, that may sound hard to get, so let me see if I can make this intuitive to you, because I think that you've had experiences that would be kind of a partial sliver of what that Godzone state looks like, that is the end of conversion. Okay? Show of hand. Any athletes in here? Yeah? Got some athletes? Have you ever experienced the zone? The zone. You know what I'm talking about? Where in the midst of a competition, all of a sudden you are so focused on the task at hand, and it's incredibly complex. I mean, you've been working at this for years, but all of a sudden it kind of comes together. Right? And you're so focused on it that even though there's screaming going on the outside and the decibel level may be high, you don't even hear it. Right? And you may not even see some other things because you're so focused on the thing at hand. And time seems to slow down. Right? And even though you're doing an incredibly complex activity, it's as if you had all the time in the world you needed to perform that action. Okay? Or musicians. You ever experience flow in the midst of a performance? Okay? That moment where all of a sudden it's like the music is playing you and you're not even aware of your fingers anymore. All you're experiencing is the music itself. You're so absorbed, right? Now, trick question. As you think of those moments when, the zone, flow, do you recall being really self-conscious? Anybody ever had flow in the midst of anxiety? Anybody ever kind of zoned while worrying what people are thinking about them? No, there's this kind of self-forgetfulness that comes with this full absorption in what you're doing. I want to say that is a created possibility that you've had an experience of. It's a little sliver. It doesn't happen all the time for most people in human life, right? But what I want to say is, the reason you can do that at all is because you were fashioned by God for a life in which that kind of absorptive engagement would be the norm, not the exception. And what you would be engaged in, what you would be absorbed in, would be simply interacting with God. You were created for what I call the Godzone. Okay? And by the way, some of you're going to be reading the Confessions. When you get to books 11 and 12, all the stuff about time and his philosophy of time, if you keep this in your mind, it will help you make sense of what's happening in that. Okay? I'm not going to go down that road further in this session. But what he's trying to explain is this experience where I'm so engaged in what God's doing with me, speaking with Him, hearing from Him, rejoicing in the progress of His kingdom, serving with Him, that everything else kind of fades to the margins. Now that's an experience that you and I were created for. And I don't know, well, let me just ask you, does that sound like something you'd want? It sound like you could have that kind of joy, that kind of all in, able to forget yourself because such good is happening through you and around you that you don't have to worry about it. That kind of experience is something that I think human beings are craving and looking for all the time. And you were created for it. You're created for it. But let me say this now. Well, actually, one more thing. If you go to Genesis 2, do this later, right? Read through Genesis 2. You'll see that Adam and Eve, before sin, were so absorbed in what they were doing with God in that garden that they were naked and completely unaware of it, okay? Talk about zoning, okay? They completely forgetful of themselves. They're not looking backward at all, right? And so you and I were created for this. And Augustine knows that, and he says this is the end point. At the place where I'm just an extension of Jesus in the world, where I'm a limb of Christ and that's it, and Daniel doesn't matter as Daniel anymore, but only as an extension of Jesus. At that point, this kind of Godzone experience happens, and that's what we were created for. Now, here's the question. How do you get there? Because I don't know about you, I don't live there that often. I don't live there all the time, right? I'm not quite here, but I'm not living there either. And so how do we move from the restless heart to the Godzone? Well, here's Augustine's formula. What we do is we descend to Christ's humility in order to ascend with Christ's divinity. Okay? So what on earth does that mean, right? What does it mean to descend to Christ in His humility so He can carry us upward? Well, what Augustine is pointing out here is that human beings for a very long time have been trying to jump straight to that zone, to that experience. And the problem is that we actually cannot live in that experience for very long, and we certainly can't have the Godzone experience that's ultimately satisfying if we try to go straight for it. Instead, what is required is for us to cling to Jesus, to cling to Christ. That's the means that God has provided to bring us from the restless heart to the Godzone. And in the simplest terms, I think we could put it this way. Okay? What this means is that if you long for that experience, don't try for the experience. Instead, just focus on Jesus. That's what it means. That humble obedience to Jesus' way is what brings us to that spot. Jesus, the one who divested himself of say over the universe he made, to become a human being, to teach fishermen, to touch lepers, to wash feet, and humbled himself to the point of death on the cross. That one, if you cling to him and follow his way, if you say, what's his way? Read Sermon on the Mount, okay? Matthew 5 and following. Jesus' way will lead from that restless heart to the Godzone. If you engage yourself with him, he will carry you to the place you never could be on your own. And so don't try to jump to the end. That's so many addictions in human life come from seeking that experience on its own. And instead, what you and I can do is we focus on Jesus, knowing that is where he brings us in the end. Okay? I want to thank you for this time together. You've got in this card a little exercise on back. And we ask you, take a look at that. If you have a moment later this week, think about what is it that stands between me and Jesus' way? What is it that distracts me from following? And take a moment to pray and ask God to help you remove that. Let me end with this benediction. Right? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.